Good evening. I want to talk to you about your drug use. Well, not just yours, mine, everyone's. It's an awkward subject in the United States where we have very specific ideas about drugs. But we need to talk about it because our thinking about drugs is completely disconnected from our behavior. It's disconnected from our drug use. Let's do a thought experiment. Close your eyes and imagine a drug user. Okay, I want you to hold that image. We'll come back to it. So let's start at the beginning. For over 40 years, the United States has waged a devastating drug war. In that same period of time, we've experienced an unprecedented boom in the pharmaceutical industry. The result of these two trends is that, on the one hand, we've incarcerated millions of drug users while becoming the most medicated people in American history. How did we get to this conflicted place about drug use, and is it where we want to be? Let's say, for the sake of conversation, no, it's not where we want to be. The thing is, we can change our behavior and our approach to drugs if we will change our thinking about drugs and the desire to use them. So let me define what I mean by drugs, because I'm sure by now your mind is just skittering around. When I say drugs, I mean psychoactive drugs. These are substances that affect our thinking, our affect, and our behavior. They include amphetamines, cocaine, hallucinogens, marijuana, opiates, alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, and psychotherapeutic drugs like antidepressants and stimulants. We rarely think about these drugs as an entire category. Instead, we tend to split them into two different kinds of drugs. We think of good drugs and bad drugs, or we think of illegal drugs and legal drugs. Cultural historian Nancy Campbell says that we tend to think of them as problem-solving drugs and problem-causing drugs. You know what I mean. These are socially created attitudes and categories, and they don't tell us very much about the effects of these drugs, but they tell us a great deal about what we think about drugs. So what are good drugs and bad drugs? Well, let's start with our stories about good drugs. We tell ourselves that good drugs are problem-solving drugs, medically necessary, or harmlessly pleasant. They're readily available in two ways. We either get access through openly available, so the caffeine you had this morning, maybe the beer you're going to have at dinner, or we have to seek them through a prescription, a physician's consent. Ask your doctor. We do. A lot. It's common. It turns out that even just a tiny subset of good drugs, the American Psychological Association says that of the psychotherapeutic drugs, use has risen 22% in the last decade. That means that 1 out of 5 of you are on at least one of these substances right now. Or across the country, 51 million people. Another 7 million use them without the consent of a physician. Consider another good drug, alcohol. 100 years ago, it was a contested substance. Now, cultural attitudes have changed, and we look back on that period of alcohol prohibition as a misguided attempt to control the desire of millions of Americans to drink. In fact, we celebrate the use of alcohol. We serve it at our social functions. We give it to gifts, to family, and complete strangers. And we expect it to be at most of our meals. In other words, alcohol is a psychoactive drug whose use has become normative for most Americans. It's a good drug. Bad drugs. Well, the stories we tell ourselves about bad drugs are that they are problem-causing. They are criminal, dangerous, addictive. They're not for medical use. In fact, we use them to avoid reality or to escape responsibility. They are a one-way ticket to self-destruction. Our media is full of the horror stories of the users of bad drugs. Do you remember the frying egg? Well, since then, we've had crack babies, meth tweakers, cokeheads, junkies. Their ravaged faces have been plastered all over public service announcements in Hollywood and television programs for decades. We know what happens to people who use bad drugs. Or do we? When I talk about drugs and desire, people make two assumptions. They assume I'm talking about illicit substances, and they assume that if you desire a substance, you can't control your use of that substance. For the majority of users of psychoactive substances in the United States, it turns out that is wrong. The National Institute of Health does an annual survey of alcohol and drug use. And in that survey, for just illicit drug users, they note that 22.5 million users use regularly, and of them, an average of 18% are addicted to whatever substances they're using, because it's a whole category of illicit substances. I say 18.5% is an average because it ranges from 10% to 30% depending on the exact drug. Of the 131 million users of alcohol, 11% become addicted. Addiction is a real issue, and many Americans struggle with it. It is also a serious social concern because of all psychoactive drugs, 15 to 30% of users become addicted. The exception is nicotine. 80% of nicotine users become addicted. But I think it's important to realize two things. The first is, when I talk about this subject, people often react right about now, and the reason is because you probably know somebody who struggles with addiction. I do, and I have compassion for that suffering. On the other hand, it's important to realize that if 15 to 30% of the users of psychoactive drugs become addicted, that means that 70 to 85% of the users don't. That means that 70 to 85% of the users of psychoactive drugs are controlled users. It's almost hard to believe because we never hear that. Instead, we tend to focus on the people who are addicted, which is a very tiny subset of a very tiny subset. But like a researcher in chemical dependence said to me, his name is Robert Whitney, it's like the flu. The virus is all around you, but not everybody gets it. So on the spectrum of people who abstain and the people who are addicted are all the other users. And what are they using? Well, of the psychoactive drugs that we could possibly use, and the ones we hear the most about are illicit drugs, under 9% of the users of all psychoactive drugs use those illegal drugs. Another 15.7% use pharmaceuticals non-medically, so recreational or repurposed for other reasons, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Another 20% use pharmaceuticals as prescribed. And then there are the majority of users, over 50% who use alcohol and over 68% who use nicotine. The thing to notice is that the majority of these drugs are socially approved. And in fact, the majority of the users of these drugs, of all of them, use in a controlled fashion. So I have to ask, can millions of happy, controlled drug users be wrong? We're all users. Whether you run 7 miles to feel energized or to shake your stress, whether you smoke that bowl before you go to a movie with your buddy, whether you drink that bottle or bottles of wine with your family, or you eat a handful of mushrooms to go out on a hike, or maybe you just have to have that first, second, and fifth cup of coffee in the morning. We're all users, and our practice reveals how we want to live. I want to talk about one substance and 3 sets of users to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. Psychostimulants have become a much more prescribed drug over the last 10 years. They're typically prescribed for psychological disorders or people who have something like attention deficit disorder. And so a lot of teenagers and college students use these drugs, and so do their friends, because everybody has figured out that these are quote-unquote performance-enhancing drugs. In other words, they help you focus for an extended period of time. So if you go onto a college campus and you go to the library, within 2 minutes you can hand a handful of Ritalin or Adderall so you can sit down and study for your exams or write a paper. It's a common practice. Well, the first set of users I want to talk about are elementary school children, because it turns out that the parents of those teenagers and college students have figured out that they have an academic edge. In fact, they now call those drugs smart drugs. And they're going to their pediatricians and asking for their middle school and elementary school age children to be put on these drugs, not because they evidence the symptoms of ADD, but because they want that performance enhancement. So I wonder if these parents know that one of the most prescribed drugs is an amphetamine. These same parents would be horrified if their children turned to methamphetamine. But as the parent of one elementary school age child who had a dramatic turnaround after being put on this drug said, well, she was miserable, so she wasn't doing her schoolwork, and she was completely socially withdrawn. Now she's happy, she's excelling at her schoolwork, and she's socially active. Why not? Why not indeed? The second group of users I want to talk about are professional athletes. So if college students have figured this out, you have to know that professional athletes have figured out that performance enhancement is a good thing. And some leagues have decided to allow the use of this drug with the prescription of a doctor. Suddenly, across Major League Baseball, every other player has ADD. It's crazy. The thing is, who can blame them? If I had to play over 180 games over the year that went on for hours and hours and sometimes extra innings, I would want a stimulant too. The third group of users are writers and thinkers. Historically, some of our most famous philosophers and writers have openly used amphetamines and have extolled their purpose for the same reason that the college kids and the high school kids and the professional athletes want to use them. They help refine focus. They help you focus for extended periods of time. So writers like W.H. Auden or Graham Greene or thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre are famous for their amphetamine use. Lots of writers use them, including this writer. When people come and tell me about the propaganda they've heard about methamphetamine, people who've clearly never tried the drug, I sometimes will say, I wrote my dissertation in 9 months with the occasional help of methamphetamine. It was a really functional drug. It worked for me. So here's my question. Does it matter if I'm a controlled user? Does it matter if I use to get my work done? If I use to feel good? Does it matter if you use to avoid feeling bad? Or your friend uses to have an introspective spiritual experience? Does it matter if we all use because we want to be celebratory and feel intoxicated? Our practices reveal how we want to live. The majority of users are controlled users of all psychoactive substances, all of them. They are your teachers, your mentors, your friends, your neighbors. Cultural norms are learned. We create them, and we can change them. I'll drink to that.